Okay, here we go. This panel is the efflorescence, what a great word. Only a poet would think of that word. The efflorescence of weird poetry. It has been a remarkable period in weird poetry over the last 10, 20, 30 years. Lots of great poets have appeared in our midst, and we have a very good array of them here today. I think we want to discuss why did weird poetry suddenly emerge from relative obscurity. What are the poets trying to say? What are their influences? There's so much we can say about weird poetry. I'm St. Joshi, and I'm the moderator because I am, mercifully, not a poet. So nobody should mistake my work for poetry. I am a critic of poetry, however. I've compiled the anthology Dreams of Fear, which is an historical anthology of weird poetry from Homer's Odyssey up to the present day. I did also edit the collected poetry of H.P. Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, Donald Wandry, and maybe some others that I've already forgotten now. So I have a great stake in weird poetry. I think we should just go down the line and let each poet introduce himself or herself. Maybe start over here.
Yeah, I'm D.L. Myers, weird poet. Yes, that's right. I'm pretty much, I can't say that I'm obsessed with H.P. Lovecraft, because it's more like he's just stuck in my head. I first read him when I was probably about 9, and it sort of warped my life ever since then. So cosmic horror is a big focus for me in what I write. So.
I'm Ashley Dioses. I've been writing poetry like all my life. Poe was a big inspiration to me. I also read a lot of horror and fantasy, so that shows up into my work. I wasn't really familiar with Lovecraft until like 5 years ago, but once I read him, I knew I found a completely new vein of poetry to write in. And that's where I discovered started writing weird poetry.
All right.
You want to start? Well, my name, I go by K.A. Opperman, but my actual name is Kyle Opperman. I guess I just write weird, fantastical horror poetry, somewhat inspired by Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith.
My name is Adam Bolivar. I write primarily ballads, which are long narrative poems written in meter and rhyme that tell a story, because I find that they sort of tap into this haunted undercurrent of folklore. I don't know what it is about ballads exactly as opposed to other forms, but it's like perfect for that kind of storytelling poetry. And I of course love Lovecraft. I don't know what connection he has with balladry or folklore, but he was a poet himself. Which I think makes it appropriate for this convention, because I think that aspect from him is a little bit neglected. He's mostly known for his tales, but he wrote a lot of poetry. I think he wrote maybe more poetry than prose overall, and some of it was very weird.
Lean forward. Just lean forward.
My name is Jason V. Brock, and I'm a filmmaker and a writer, and I do poetry. I wouldn't say that I'm always just weird poetry myself. Some of my poetry is not weird at all, but I used to do a lot of strict and formal verse, and then I got that kind of out of my system, and my work was all wiped out in a Hurricane Hugo, and so I had to recreate some of it from just what I remembered. And so after that I did more free verse kinds of things, but definitely dark and horrible and dreary and evil, and a lot of Poe, a lot of Lovecraft, a lot of all these influences of other people.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go too much into the history of weird poetry, but it's a fascinating subject. I mean, you could go all the way back to classical antiquity for that, but I think it's safe to say that weird poetry pretty much started about the same time weird fiction started. I mean, referring to the Gothic novelists of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, who were then joined by the great weird romantic poets of their day, some of whom produced a good modicum of weird poetry, namely Samuel Taylor Coleridge with the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Percy Bysshe Shelley actually wrote some early weird poetry when he was, and he actually wrote some too really bad Gothic novels also, but they're tremendously bad. You can't believe how bad they are.
Lord Byron?
Byron wrote a few weird poems. I wouldn't say, mostly they're not so much weird as just dark,
Right.
And sort of brooding melancholy. I think, as in so many other aspects of weird fiction, Poe was a great revolutionary here. He really, he really focused on the weird in his poetry, and I think a lot of poets at this panel remain justifiably influenced by Poe's example. But then, you did have the Lovecraft circle, where an amazing number of really fine poets better than Lovecraft, in fact, emerged. Not only Clark Ashton Smith, who I think we all agree is probably the finest weird poet ever, and one of the great poets ever, but people like Samuel Loveman, not very well known, but he was a fine poet. Donald Wandrei wrote good stuff. Frank Belknap Long wrote some good stuff. I wonder if anybody has thoughts about this poetic circle that Lovecraft gathered to himself.
Well, like ST says, there was a lot of the writers in the Lovecraft circle initially began as poets. I think that's an important thing to note. Donald Wandrei is a pretty excellent poet in my estimation. Maybe not, well, certainly not on Clark Ashton Smith's level, but there's plenty of merit there. He focused primarily on formal, metered verse. There was a few looser pieces in there. Frank Belknap Long, he was a really good poet too, and it's just important to note that a lot of these Weird Tales circles Lovecraft circle writers began as poets, and before they began expressing what we today call weirdness or atmosphere, they were using poetry as a vehicle to express that, oftentimes before they turned to prose, and then later they would derive ideas from their poetry, such as the case as Lovecraft's I don't even want to say the title because there's so much dispute on how to pronounce it, but the fungi from Yugoth, you know the one I'm talking about. So he would later go back and get his
The mushroom one.
Yeah, the mushroom one. So a lot of the times these poets would get ideas initially. These weird ideas would surface in the poems first, and then they could take them and maybe expand them later in fiction.
I want to say that one thing is really common, of course, across literature is a lot of writers start as poets. That was true for Hemingway and Fitzgerald as well, in the modern
Raymond
era.
Chandler, too, oddly enough.
Chandler, yeah, and that is odd, actually.
Yeah, very odd.
But a lot of us start as poetry, right? That's how all I wrote initially was poetry, and then I got into prose more. So I still write prose and poetry and a lot of nonfiction. So I think that's a real common thread, with a lot of them. Would you agree?
Yeah, well, I saw in a 1930 census record that H.P. Lovecraft put his occupation as poet, and that was a long time after he'd been a pretty established writer, but even at that late stage, he still considered himself a poet overall. I think he was kind of a frustrated poet, really, because he got most of his recognition from his prose writing, but his whole life he wrote poetry, and I think he probably wished he was better recognized for that. And a lot of it, people have said, will kind of say that he wasn't that good of a poet, and I guess that's arguable, but his best poetry was really among the best, like Fungi from Yugoth, for example. That's some of the best weird poetry ever written, I think.
Yeah.
So,
Although I think Lovecraft would have admitted, and came close to admitting, that one major inspiration for the Fungi from Yugoth was Donald Wandrei's sonnet sequence called Sonnets of the Midnight Hours, which had been written just a couple of years before, and then Wandrei had sent them to Lovecraft around 1927. and then Lovecraft wrote his poetry cycle in late 1929 into 1930. And of course, both Lovecraft and Wandrai and these other poets published in Weird Tales and the magazine Weird Tales, and that was a real focus for weird poetry. In fact, Lovecraft prided himself on persuading the first editor of Weird Tales, Edwin Baird, to give up or to yield on his no poetry policy and to publish the work of Clark Ashton Smith. Whether that really happened or not, I'm not entirely sure, but Lovecraft thought it was, because he was really pushing Baird to publish this great poet Smith, whom he had just discovered a year or so earlier, before the founding of Weird Tales. I think no praise is too great for Clark Ashton Smith, so I wonder if people have something to say about Smith's poetry.
Well, Clark Ashton Smith is very atmospheric poetry. His wording and his uses of archaic vocabulary makes the poem sound really, not only beautiful, but really intricate. He puts a lot of thought and focus into it, and when you read his poetry, it just takes you to another world, and it's amazing because he's not only is he a great fantasy prose writer, but his poetry is just like on a whole nother level. In fact, I didn't really read much poetry other than Poe until I read Clark Ashton Smith. It just took me to a whole new level.
I actually wanted to say one more thing about the sonnet cycle trend. I think we should at least mention that it's become almost like a trend in Lovecraftian poetry, that it began with Wandrai and the Sonnets for the Midnight Hours, and then Lovecraft's Fungi from Yuggoth, and a lot of contemporary weird poets have tried their hands at the sonnet cycle as vehicle for, conveying a weird narrative. Anne K. Schwader, I'm not sure. Schwader. There's Dreams from Malia, Lynn Carter. There's almost innumerable Lovecraftian sonnets. I've tried my hand at it. I mean, there's almost more to count out there, more than I can count, and they spin these elaborate narratives solely in poetry form. And so that's one way that weird poetry today is being used to convey weird narratives, weird atmosphere, weird plots that conventionally would be restricted to, like a story. Poetry is proving that it can be a vehicle for such narratives as well.
Well, I think that, I'm sorry, what is it?
Oh, yeah, well, I was just going to say, I mean, if you're a fan of weird effects, like you like weird fiction, I don't think there's anything more weird than poetry, because poetry isn't about character development or plot. It's basically all about atmosphere and all about the psychological effect. And I think that's what the best weird fiction is aiming for. So, I mean, what better medium for that than poetry?
Yeah, I was thinking, people were talking about that a lot of the Lovecraft circle were, potentially frustrated poets. I think that I'm a frustrated prose writer. So I'm the and what Kyle was saying about sonnet cycles or sequences, that's something that I'm getting into, that I'm sort of really fascinated by telling a story, through a series of sonnets, through a series of poems. That it gives you a whole different, for me, it works better at this point. I mean, I want to write prose, but it just, I'm not able at this point yet. I haven't been able to successfully do that.
Yeah, I was going to, go ahead.
I was gonna say, it's a different series of rules. Like in a story, there's like an exposition, there's a plot, there's character, does this, goes, there's a resolution, a climax. In poetry, all that's out the window. It's sort of more kind of dream logic, which is fundamentally weird, I think. Like, you don't really know what's going on. You kind of like maybe don't even understand what happened until after, like a year after you read it or something. And that's something you can only really achieve in a sonic cycle.
I think you could say that even about Shakespeare's sonnets, where the person speaking, you would assume it's Shakespeare, is a continuous character, that's recurring and talking about different aspects. So I think a lot of this cyclical aspect comes from, things like Shakespeare and other antecedents. But I would say too that Homeric epics, this was a lot of weird stuff going on there too, in the form of myth and folklore. But I was going to say a lot of the weird poetry that I've read seems to come from a place of more formal verse, you know, and structures and things like this. But I think that you could actually get, like I've read some dark poems by like Langston Hughes and other writers, and I think you can get a lot of darkness out of free verse, I've found, and I've done several that are like that, that are really interesting, you know, and I don't think you have to be necessarily locked into structured formal verse. You know, I think in actual way that can limit the form, you know, as far as weird poetry, in my estimation. If you stick exclusively to that, that's...
I got it. Well, I think that weird poetry is not so much constrained to like formal or free or whatever, but I think it's a poetry of effects. I think all good poetry should be a poetry of effects, but fantasy, weird poetry, I think, emphasizes that maybe a little more. Like you want to get those repeated consonants, those repeated rhymes, just almost so it's almost like you're speaking like a magic spell, like a Clark Ashton.
An incantation.
Yeah, that's what Smith would say. So, I mean, you can have effects in any kind of poetry. Rhyme, meter, those are just two tools in like a much larger toolbox. So as long as you're, whatever form, whatever outer shell you decide to use, as long as you're using plenty of effects, then you can get some pretty cool stuff that's going to stick with you, some pretty weird stuff. I mean, weirdness
The weird
itself,
to me, though, is conceptual more than artifact. You know, I mean, it is a mindset in a way. You know, it's established.
But it comes out through language, and,
Right.
and the quintessence of weird poetry is the deft use of language, not character development, because there are very few characters of any meaningful sense. And so if you don't have the gift for language, you're gonna have a difficult time. In terms of the conflict between, you know, formal verse and free verse, well, you know, I do edit a magazine called Spectral Realms with Hippocampus Press. Unfortunately, the fifth issue's come out, but the sixth, unfortunately, will be the last issue because it's not selling so well. But anyway, I'll be honest with you, I mean, I hope it's not just my prejudice, but I publish a whole lot more formal verse than free verse. I mean, a lot of the free verse I get is either intrinsically formless or, what's even worse, indistinguishable from prose. It's just, it's pieces of prose cut up in uneven lines. That's not poetry. You have to have, you know, imagery and symbolism and metaphor to
I think
to
rhyming to some degree.
rhyming, I think, is actually more artificial than...
I don't mean like systemic, but I mean, I think sometimes occasional rhyming.
Well, rhyming
any
might
rhyming is better.
It's
might
part of
help
poetry.
you, but I mean, you know, obviously there have been great poets of blank verse too. But free verse is actually very, very difficult to pull off well, and you know, a lot of people think free verse is simple and easy. It isn't. So you might, I mean, if you're a budding poet, you might want to start writing formal verse, learn the rules first before you break or bend them.
It helps set the mood. Like if you write in formal verse, it gives a certain mood and atmosphere.
Train
And
your
I
mind.
think it's harder to do with free verse if you not have the right flow to it.
It's harder to do, but it's not impossible. I mean, Clark Ashton Smith, even, who I would agree is possibly the greatest weird poet of all time. I mean, he's on my T-shirt and all that. You know, gotta represent.
Yes.
Even he wrote some free verse, some freer, non-rhyming type stuff, but when you read it, it's like you're not even noticing that it's like not rhyming or anything, because it's full of effects. It's like you can tell this guy like didn't just throw these words onto the page. Like it's full of effects, it's full of thought, it's carefully laid out. I think bad poetry is just poetry that's just lacking in the tools. Like they just kind of threw the words on there, and they're lacking in the a masterful control of language.
Well, I would argue even Lovecraft's stories verge on being prose poetry. I mean, he's more concerned with the language, the effect, the sort of incantation, you know, the hypnotic quality of it. Yeah, or Pugmire.
Bradbury.
So he wasn't really frustrated. I think that was how he got out of his frustrations as being a poet. Is he found a new form for it, even though he didn't realize he was writing poetry. I think that's really what it was.
Well, yeah, Lovecraft actually shows the disadvantage of being too wedded to formal verse, because he early on, as a child, developed a fondness for the 18th century, both in prose and especially in verse. Writers like, John Dryden from the late 17th century into people like Alexander Pope and Samuel Johnson and a whole lot of other ones. I mean, he had a very impressive collection of those standard poets from the 18th century in his library, and he just somehow came to think that was his natural mode of expression as a poet. But it really wasn't. You can't go back to the 18th century. He was living in the early 20th century, and it simply didn't work. And a lot of his poetry ends up being sort of very mechanical as a way of tricking himself into thinking that he was back in the 18th century, and it's there's very poor use of imagery, and the rhymes are just pretty standard, and everything is all metrical, but there's no life in it, and only when later on, I think partially when he discovered the poetry of Clark Ashton Smith in 1922, some people had passed on some of his early books to Lovecraft, and Lovecraft said, "Wow, here's a poet who's writing, much freer idiom. I mean, some formal verse, but some not, but writing mostly, in a more contemporary idiom, still using fairly elevated language, but really, really vibrant poetry that put his own work to shame." And so it's no accident, I think, that from 1922 to 1928, Lovecraft actually wrote very little poetry indeed. I mean, a very small number of poems in that period. And then, he sort of, rethought his whole attitude to what poetry is. And that's when he started writing The Funter from Yuggoth. But Adam, going back to some of your work, you appeal to, or you draw upon even older sources of poetry. Why don't you talk about a book you will be having from Campus Press next year, I hope, which is a mix of both prose and poetry.
Yes, I have a book coming out next year, or I don't know if it's next year, but soon, called The Lay of Old Hex, which is a series of ballads, but they're intertwined with stories. It kind of goes back and forth between prose and balladry, but I'm telling stories that are inspired by British folklore, mostly from the 17th century or going back to medieval times. I find all stories at that time, like Shakespeare wrote all his plays in iambic pentameter, or if you read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, that was all written in verse. Like basically anything at that time was written in verse. There was no such thing as free prose, pretty much. But I find that if you write in that style, and in particular that metrical form, it's 8 syllables, 6 syllables, 8 syllables, 6 syllables. It kind of evokes that time period in a way that no other metrical form does. I don't know. It's like a magical incantation.
They're talking about dramatic, presentation, because that's the root of drama, right?
Right.
Is these memorized things. Like I just did a poem, not to intrude on you, but to kind of bolster what you're saying. And it's based on a work by a man named Edgar Lee Masters called The Spoon River Anthology. And so what I did is an homage of my own and modernized it in my next collection that's coming out. So, I went back to that kind of dramatic aspect of it.
Well, I think people were memorizing great swaths of material, and the meter and the rhyme helped them encant it, basically. Like you couldn't remember 10,000 lines of poetry unless it had that kind of like sing-song quality. Yeah, it's totally a mnemonic device. But also, like when you read it out loud, it has kind of a hypnotic quality to it. It kind of puts you in a dream state and makes you receptive to the story.
So it's easier to remember a song than like a story.
Yeah,
Yes,
it's a lot more akin to music than it is to prose. And indeed, the ballads were sung. I mean, a lot of the traditional ballads, or all of them, were passed down orally by bards. I personally am not very musical, so I consider myself more of a ballad librettist than a ballad performer, a ballad maker. But in the 17th century, there were a lot of chapbooks that were printed cheaply, like for a penny, and there were these long ballads written in that form, and they had these woodcut illustrations. And that's my main inspiration. There's a favorite character was a figure named Jack, who was kind of a trickster character.
Like Jack and the Beanstalk?
like Jack and the Beanstalk or Jack the Giant Killer.
Jack stories are very
There's dozens of Jack stories, not just Jack and the Beanstalk, that are largely forgotten in the modern time. But if you read my book, you'll hear a lot more of them. He makes for good company, I find.
I believe we have some, well, I think everybody here is working on poetry, but I think one person in particular also has a book forthcoming, so why don't you talk about your book, Ashley?
My book is called Diary of a Sorceress, and it's mostly dark fantasy and horror. It definitely has inspirations from Poe, Clark Ashton Smith, Lovecraft, The King in Yellow, basically a lot of old Gothic novels and novellas. One of my favorite poets I ever read is On Carathis. It's actually from Willem Beckford's novella Vathek. That is one of the first Gothic novellas I've ever read, and that just totally inspired me to write. I have a whole clique of femme fatale poems about different villains from different Gothic novellas, and that's one of them. I also use some females from Clark Ashton Smith stories. I wrote about Naito Chris from Lovecraft. And there's a lot of dark, evocative poems in that one, and that should be out late next year, maybe 2018.
You know, I mentioned that a lot of weird poetry is published in the magazine Weird Tales, and a natural segue to that was Arkham House. When August Derleth and Donald Wandrei founded Arkham House, both of those were poets. Derleth was a poet, wrote very little weird poetry. His poetry is mostly mainstream, lyric, sort of love poetry, things like that. But he was a poet, and a pretty good one. So I think Wandrei in particular wanted to have Arkham House be a sort of showcase for weird poetry, both old and new. And so they started publishing, slim volumes of poetry from time to time with Arkham House. They did Smith, they did Lovecraft, they did Wandrei, they did Leah Bodine Drake, a Horn Book for Witches, which is an extremely rare and expensive volume because apparently I think it was most of the poetry volumes from Arkham House were actually subsidized by the poets. And so I think Drake ended up with most of those copies and then sort of gave them out or sold them, on her own.
the rarest Arkham.
It is extremely rare, but there will be a new edition of that. We're trying to do her collected poetry and fiction in addition. She wrote a few short stories with Hippocampus Press. We have discovered a whole lot of uncollected poetry by Leah Bodine Drake. Not all of it weird, but we're going to publish it anyway because it's all good stuff. Her paper's down at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, and my colleague David E. Schultz is going to go down there sometime and look up some poetry scrapbooks of hers that are down there. But anyway, there's that.
He's doing his book too.
What?
Schultz's.
Yeah, well, I'll get to that in a minute. But one of the other Arkham House poets, there was Stanley McNeil. Actually, is a pretty good poet from the 1960s. Joseph Payne Brennan, I actually think was a better poet than a short story writer.
Yeah, I think so.
And I may be uttering heresy here, but I also think Robert E. Howard was a better poet than a short story writer. And Arkham House did a couple volumes of his poetry. And then, even after Derleth died, they continued that tradition. They did Richard L. Tierney's collected poems, which is a magnificent volume. So I like to think that Hippocampus Press has sort of taken over the tradition of publishing weird poetry, that Arkham House began. So maybe we can talk about some other contemporary poets that you find particularly appealing. I mean, we've mentioned Anne Schrader, who I think is a very eminent poet, but what are some of the other favorites among your contemporaries?
Tierney would probably, for me, would be one. I actually discovered him in Spectral Realms, and then bought a book of his collected poems, and he fascinates me because he's doing what turns me on, which is trying to tell a tale in a poem. It's either that or and he does it so well. Actually, one of my favorites by him is called Autumn Chill. And it's basically like it's a prose poem, but it's basically like a little short story, but it's like a little slice of something, where it's something very strange, but I found it very inspiring, because that's what I like to do, which is tell a tale through the story, tell a story in the poem that I'm trying to write, or the series of poems that I'm trying to write. And Tierney, he's just pretty amazing how he uses language, and it's very powerful. So he would definitely be at the top of my list.
I can think of some. I can think of Wade German.
It was sitting right back there.
Yeah, oh yeah, Wade, definitely Wade too.
And I think of John Shirley, who didn't write poetry until very recently. And you've published several of his. I can think of Dan Glore has written some very good weird poetry. And Jonathan Thomas, actually, also. He's there. There's Dan. There's Wade. John left the building. So he's like the Elvis of the group. But, so all of them, I think, have written really interesting things that mainly came through for me with Spectral Realms. So, I mean, you have done an actual poetry book, right? No, but you have that book you're working on. Have you actually done, and you did a book of poetry, but have you done collect pieces in your collections or anything like that? No? Well, see, I have.
In your 5th story collection, there will be poetry included. That'll come out next year.
Yeah, because I usually put poetry in mine whenever we do my collections. So, I think that's a good thing to break up the prose. So I like all of those.
Anybody else among your favorites?
Well, most of my favorite contemporary word poets are sitting right here, but Lee Blackmore has written some really excellent stuff. Kyla Ward, I like a lot of her stuff. Yes, I have that book. That's a really excellent book.
Anne Schwader, I would.
Yeah, of course, Anne Schwader. She's probably the queen of Lovecraftian poetry. Is the queen.
Scott?
I wanted to mention a couple other names. Fred Phillips writes some great, fantastical, Renaissance, medieval type stuff, published by Hippocampus. Michael Fantina, he's maybe not as well known. He should be. He writes some great fantasy and Swinburne-inspired stuff. And like Adam said, a lot of my favorite poets are right here.
That's good.
Yeah.
Well, Donald Sidney
Fryer.
He's more fantasy than horror, but definitely a powerful poet. And he will be the poet guest of honor at Necronomicon next year in Providence, Rhode Island, so that'll be good. And
his new book's out. It's on the Hippocampus table.
It's his autobiography,
Yeah.
but at the end there's a bunch of his uncollected poetry.
He's a great character also.
Yeah, we will be doing a big volume of Mike Fantina's poetry with Hippocampus, maybe even this year, but it's pretty much done, so either late this year or early next. A fine collection. What is that?
I knew Mike before I knew you.
Oh yeah, that goes back a ways. So it's we're really a great period of weird poetry here. What was I going to say? Anything else you want to say?
Speak up, Adam.
What are some other venues for weird poetry? I mean, as I say, Spectral Realms is about to die, unfortunately.
Well, Nameless is still alive, and we do publish poetry. I published Wade. I published Wade a couple of times, I think, in Nameless, and some other poets too. So I'm putting in something of Dan's in there. So.
I have my weird fiction review from Centipede Press has a handful of poems. I can't include that many, and unfortunately he refuses to pay for it, which is indignity. But how low has poetry fallen in our age? But at least he publishes it, so that's something. But what are some other venues?
Weird Book publishes.
Weird Book, the resurrected version, that we're going on issue 33. We started with 31, 32's out, 33 will be out soon.
That's a continuation of the number.
Yeah.
They haven't put out 33 issues yet.
Yeah.
The Audience Void.
Oh yeah.
That's a good little. It's almost like an amateur press almost type thing. It's like a little paper magazine, but they're publishing some really good stuff with an emphasis on poetry.
There's also Skelos.
That's what I was going to
Yeah.
Dark fantasy in the vein of Robert E. Howard.
Scott's got an essay in Skelos.
I just did an interview with ST and Lynn Jamnek for Skelos. So
they're a paying market for poetry.
Yeah.
Are they?
Yeah,
Well,
propane.
that's pretty amazing.
We pay pro rates also. It's like we're intermittent.
Well, what was interesting about the audio void is that the person who did this, who puts out the audio void, Obadiah Baird, he wasn't intending to publish poetry, but we all sent him a bunch of poetry, and then he read it and he said, "Oh, this is actually really good. I like it." You know, I didn't realize I liked poetry so much. I always just like Lovecraft and weird fiction, and once he actually read it, he realized that he liked it. And I think that might be the attitude of a lot of people if they actually read it. They might, if you're a fan of Lovecraft and weird fiction, if you actually read the weird poetry, you might realize that you really connect with it. But I don't think a lot of people give it a chance.
Yeah, I think it's obviously been a long time since I've been in school, but I get the impression poetry isn't taught much in schools anymore. I mean, I could be wrong, but you have a comment?
My wife has been head of the Oregon Poetry Association for the last 5 years, and the number of entries from the state poetry, the school poetry competition has been going down steadily for 40 years.
Yeah, I suspect so, which is a shame, but somehow poetry doesn't resonate with our society anymore. I don't know why that should be, but
At the same time, people are writing more poetry than they have certainly in my lifetime.
well,
A lot of it's bad though.
Yeah, I think there are a lot more. There are a lot more poets. There are a lot more people writing poetry than reading it, and that's not a good situation. I think we need to get back and start young people, very young, in first, second, third grade, reading, simple poetry, so that it becomes a part of their world somehow.
I think part of the problem with why poetry is so unpopular is a lot of the poems they teach in school, at least to a young person, are boring.
Yeah.
They were boring to me, they're boring
Yeah.
to everyone else. I've come to appreciate some of it as I've read more poetry and I've got like a refined taste, but when you're like 18 and you have to read Shakespeare, you're like, I don't want to read Shakespeare.
I loved Chaucer and Shakespeare and
Yeah.
Frost, all that stuff when I was younger though.
If they read
That's
some
one of the
more-
first things, and I was in the first, I remember being in this first day of school, like of the first grade, and there was a Frost poem that I memorized that I still remember.
Yeah, he's got
called
some good
House
stuff.
Sphere, and that poem like really kind of turned me on to, reading other kinds of work. But it was a very
Yeah.
dark poem, strangely enough. It just happened to be the reason.
I think maybe if they taught some more fantasy-oriented or something that's more accessible to younger people or kids, then maybe poetry could be cool again. Like, as cool as poetry could be, I think.
Yeah.
Weird poetry, I think, is more accessible. I mean, I know it's still real niche and real obscure, but I think for me, like, it was my gateway into poetry. I started by reading Lovecraft and Smith. Before I read their poetry, I didn't really care much for poetry. I had read a few things in college, and it was all right. I mean, it kind of interested me, but I wasn't really hooked till I read Smith, and I was like, wow, this stuff is cool. Like, I didn't know poetry could be that cool.
What was it?
Which poem? Or?
No, what was it about?
I think it was the use of the language, the exotic images, the language, just the remoteness, the sheer escapism of it. For me, it was more appealing than, say, a love sonnet by Shakespeare, which I like Shakespeare now, but when I was, if you're not a poetry fan, sometimes it can be a little dense.
Shakespeare's going to have a hell of a career. And I can tell you something else. And I think something else. But I think also people like, when you get into more, sometimes esoteric and dark poetry, like I mentioned Langston Hughes, some of that is pretty dark. And some of it also, like James Dickey, he's a fantastic poet and did some really, really dark work. But it's more what you would call, I guess, contemporary literary, now is what we would call it, but to me it just really is fantastic stuff.
Well, Poe is obviously a good starting point for kids. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just fun. I mean, if you read it out loud, it sounds
That's something like The Raven, which has
Yeah.
a unique meter.
The Raven is still an effective poem, no
Yeah.
matter how hackneyed it might have seemed to have become. It is still a powerful poem.
But I don't think poetry is going to disappear though. I mean, in the 19th century, you would read your evening paper and there'd be poetry in it and people would just read it for fun. And now
Poets could get rich.
it seems
Yeah.
like nobody, except for a very small fringe of people, really likes poetry. But I don't think poetry is going to go away. Maybe in another 100 years it'll come back or something. But I mean, it's been with our civilization since the beginning. It ebbs and flows, but this is probably kind of an ebb but we have to keep it alive.
Literacy is also kind of ebbing. So
And I think that weird poetry, as a broad term for, you know, supernatural, fantasy, what have you, could be a force in possibly making poetry at least a little more popular, or reinvigorate it and maybe make it more accessible. For me, it's gotten me into discovering the whole larger world of poetry. I know it's been that way for other people too, so hopefully if we keep reading and writing and highlighting weird poetry, publishing it, it will do a service to culture in general, ultimately. I mean, at least ideally.
I think actually the distinction between weird poetry and sort of regular poetry, if there is such a thing, is less than the distinction between weird fiction and mainstream fiction, because poetry in itself is a kind of fantastic expression. I mean, you know, a lot of poetry uses myth and you know, folklore and symbolism. So that's why so many great poets have dabbled in specifically weird poems. You were talking about Robert Frost. He had a really very dark vision of the world, and he's not this cheerful, you know, gung-ho American poet that he's portrayed as being. He is a very brooding guy, you know, rather cheerless. And you know, as I was researching my
he's a cheerless New Englander.
That's right. I mean, you know, as I was researching my Dreams of Fear anthology, I kept coming upon weird poems just by people you'd never expect to write weird poetry. Like Longfellow wrote some weird stuff. Thomas Hardy, you know, after Thomas Hardy wrote, you know, his great novels, but you know, his later novels were strongly criticized, so he simply gave up writing novels and wrote either poetry or poetic dramas. And some of that is powerfully weird. You even have stuff from people like James Russell Lowell and Oliver Wendell Holmes, who seem pretty, you know, dry and standard and boring, but it's you know, it's pretty remarkable. I mean, the same thing happened in weird fiction too, of course. You know, where you have people like Henry James suddenly writing The Turn of the Screw, or you know, D.H. Lawrence writing The Rocking Horse Winter. But it happens a lot in the history of poetry.
Well, there's also people like E. Cummings, who are really strange, had some weird imagery in his stuff, and you know, other people we consider more, you know, modernist kind of thing. And Eliot, of course, did like, you know, his whole Wasteland and, you know, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. There's a lot of weird imagery, you know, involved in that, but it's not weird poetry, you know, as you would call it.
Well, when I tried to describe my poetry as weird balladry or spectral balladry, but then I realized that's kind of redundant, because balladry is weird. I mean, it's all about like fairies and headless horsemen and, you know, Thomas the Rhymer, Tom of Bedlam, all that sort. So I mean, poetry has always been weird. I think someone pointed out about the demise of spectral realms, that maybe describing it as weird poetry was not a good marketing.
It just had too much poetry in it.
Yeah. Well. I don't think the average person knows what weird means. We all know weird is associated with weird fiction, but weird to most people just think like Weird Al Yankovic or something. Like it's just like it's
Weird Al Yankovic.
It's wacky. It's weird.
It's very Lovecraftian.
maybe the weird.
And his tentacle of beard.
Maybe calling it dark poetry or horror poetry would have been better.
Well, I think also weird poetry, you know, I mean, I think of like Dante's Inferno and Milton, you know, some of that is pretty weird, but so for me it's a very broad and wide gamut, I guess you would say, of what I would consider weird, so that's why I'm singing some of E. Cummings or this or that, or, yeah, because it's weird, it kind of pops up, you know, it's very few the people that do just weird, you know what I mean, and I'm not sure that that's even desirable. I think you should stretch and do other things and try other forms and stuff. I think Scott.
There's definitely, if you know, you want to go back, you look inside Homer and Virgil, you're going to find some really horrific scenes.
Oh, yeah.
Especially the one where in the Odyssey, when Ulysses goes down to the Hades to interrogate the shade of Tiresias. And then you had the same thing in the Aeneid when Virgil sought out his father.
Seems to me that Howard was very interested in mythology. Is that accurate?
Howard?
Yeah.
Oh yes, definitely.
More than like Lovecraft, I mean, specifically.
Yeah, surely. I mean,
He didn't have as much opportunity to get a hold of a lot of stuff that Lovecraft did. Getting a hold of even comic books in his part of Texas was a major logistical feat.
Yeah.
But he wrote a lot of those, I guess, sort of ballad type poetry, not quite the same what you were like. I think a lot of his inspiration was people like Rudyard Kipling and people like that. But it's rousing stuff. I mean, it's it really sort of boils down the essence of his whole idea of the conflict of barbarism and civilization. And he wrote a lot of it. I mean, his collected poetry is simply enormous. I mean, probably more than Lovecraft. And Lovecraft wrote a lot. And
I wrote a song that has a lyric by Robert E. Howard, and the lyric I used was "The Skull Amid the Stars," or so. But I used that as a basis. I added one stanza because it was short. But I did use it. I'm not sure I could use it legally, but I did use it in the demo.
But I did,
because I'm not sure the status of some of the poetry.
I mean, when you were, I think when Kyle was talking about what poetry you focus on and teach in schools, I think that Howard should be at the head of that list because he's just like a master of telling a tale.
It was pretty violent, though.
Yeah, a lot. Well, things that, not violent, but compared to what's out there today, I don't know if it's that much more violent.
I mean, for teaching.
I don't know. Yeah, some of it, but yeah.
But it's fun. Crushed him. You know what I mean?
I will lay your heart on my father's smoking board.
Scott?
You didn't mention when you were talking about Smith, Lutman, Walter Ryan Long, all the poets in the Lovecraft circle. One thing that they all had in common, with the exception of Lovecraft, was they all were in contact with George Sterling.
Yes. I forgot that I did edit 3 volumes of the poetry of George Sterling. Yeah, wading through those 3 volumes is probably a task, but maybe we should. I did do a selection of his best weird poetry called The Thirst of Satan. Sterling, really, he is a magnificent poet. He was basically a pupil of Ambrose Bierce, who wrote some weird poetry amongst a lot of other poetry that's mostly satirical and humorous. But then he himself became the early mentor of Smith. Although I think Smith ultimately surpassed him, but Sterling wrote some great poetry, and a lot of it is sort of on the borderline of the weird, but it's all supremely well crafted. And he did some poetic dramas that are just incredible. Lilith and Rosamund in particular are just tremendous, poetic dramas, very much sort of in the Shakespearean mode, or more like somebody like Thomas Lovell Meadows' Death's Jest book, which is another great work that was done around the Poe period, around 1850. So try to look up some Sterling if possible.
Some of the Bible is pretty weird.
Well,
Book of Revelation.
Book of Revelation, yeah, is
Genesis
very bizarre.
Why would you say that?
Paradise Lost is a good weird poem.
Well, yeah, I included a chunk of the book 2 of Paradise Lost, which is, of course, the passage about Satan and hell in my Dreams of Fear thing.
That's what one of our poems was about Satan as he was cast out of hell, falling from heaven.
Yeah. So I think we should, since we mentioned Ambrose Bierce, Sterling, we all should talk about Nora Mae French, lesser known woman poet who should be known more. She wrote some weird material. She was, like Smith, she was Sterling's pupil in weird or formal verse. Unfortunately, she killed herself at a young age, but
in Sterling's house. Not a good move for a
in
guest.
the same bed as his wife, right?
Or close to it. They were, whatever.
Yeah. There's this whole lineage that.
This is a real downer all of a sudden, man.
Yeah. Well, I thought
talking about weird poetry.
I thought we should just touch on what Donald Sidney Fryer calls the California Romantics, and there's this sort of lineage where Ambrose Bierce was Sterling's mentor, and then Sterling mentored Nora Mae French, and then Clark Ashton Smith. It could be argued that Smith was sort of a mentor figure to Donald Sidney Fryer, and then it's argued that he's sort of like the last torch of the California Romantics. We should talk a little bit more about Don. I mean, he's a masterful poet. He wrote the songs and sonnets Atlantean,
which is mostly prose poems, but still very, very well done.
Really good stuff. Reimaginings of what Atlantis might have been like. It's written as if it were real. I mean, it doesn't get any more. At its heart, I think weird poetry in some way can also be called imaginative poetry. And
Well, I think some of these poets too that you could extend this umbrella as we've been stating, and I would add Ginsberg in there. Allen Ginsberg, he's like Howl is a pretty insane work, and very good though. And he's done a lot of other good things. And William S. Burroughs, I think, has written the only actual weird novel, in my estimation, which would be Naked Lunch. I mean, I think that is like not only is it a fucking just total freak out, but it's like has a rhythmical and hypnotic kind of quality to it if you read it. It's not just a bunch of stuff strung together. It was actually edited together by Ginsberg from a bunch of his works. And so I think that you have to include some of the beat work in that, because that would be where that tradition came from. And even people like William F. Nolan has written weird, strange little poems all throughout his career. And he is a very good poet, actually. In some ways, I think he might be a better poet than a prose writer, but he is a fine prose writer as well. But I think that he's done some of his best work in the prose in poetry, and you've read a fair amount of it yourself.
Yep.
And that would have been in like the Southern California Writing School.
Willem Pugmire likes to include poetry in his stories. Kind of, I think he's harking back to Poe in that regard, because Poe did that in Fall the House of Usher and several other stories. Not a lot of time left, but maybe I have a couple questions from the audience. Sorry.
I was wondering if you consider William Blake a weird poet.
Yes.
I can't remember if he was in Dreams of Fear.
I did include an early poem by Blake in Dreams of Fear, but the later poetry is very difficult. I mean, it's hard to excerpt.
I think of his painting, the Ghost of the Flea, as like a perfect example.
Well, Jerusalem
He's a great artist.
he made this whole mythology about England being like one of the lost tribes of Israel, and like he created this whole world of Albion, and Albion's seed was America, but he had Zeus and all these weird demons and angels that he made up.
He was basically insane.
He was a fantasist. He was a fantasist for sure.
yeah.
A lot of his writing I love, so, and his art.
The one poet, I don't know if I really exhausted his complete output, which is huge. William Wordsworth, I didn't find anything weird in his stuff, but
What the hell with him then?
Yeah.
Don't write him off. What about Yeats?
I did find a Yeats poem, yeah.
5 minutes. Okay.
There's this one poet that is very obscure that no one's ever heard of, but I think deserves a look in. His name is Thomas Chatterton. He lived in the 18th century, and he had this fascination. He was very like Lovecraft. He believed he lived in another time. He actually lived in the 18th century, but he wanted to live in the 15th century, and he made up.
What is it with these guys?
He made up this figure named Rowley, who was a monk who wrote all this faux medieval poetry that people thought was actually written in the 15th century, but he forged it all basically, and he died. He killed himself at age 17.
Yeah.
And he invented the term slughorn in his poetry that Robert Browning thought was a real thing, like a real medieval instrument, and he put it in Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came. Like Roland blows a slughorn at the end. That is actually made up. It came from Chatterton. It was not a real thing.
So Lamort
He was sort of the Bard Ossian of his day.
Anyway,
He was very much like Ossian, the same kind of thing.
You had a question here?
Oh, actually, I was wondering,
Or
would
comment?
you consider Thomas Ligotti's poetry weird or more dark?
He had a volume called Death Poems. I think they're just sort of brooding, misanthropic, pessimistic, which is what Ligotti is. But I have to confess, I I didn't cotton to those poems very well. I thought they were a little too prose-like. I would have, I don't know, they didn't really do it for me, but
It loses the poeticness.
yeah, I mean, Ligotti's prose is so poetic in itself that you don't need to look any farther than that.
That's like Bradbury, though.
The early Bradbury, yeah, sure. Bradbury wrote an enormous amount of poetry, most of which is
Terrible.
very bad. But he admitted, and you'll get this from Bill Nolan, and you'll see him on Sunday, he'll be here. Bradbury admitted that he wrote like a poem or two in the morning just to kind of wake himself up.
Right.
You know? It was just like getting himself going. So maybe he didn't
priming himself.
He didn't take himself very seriously as a poet. So.
One we didn't mention was Fritz Leiber's Demons of the Upper Air.
Ah, yes. This is a very early work by Leiber that he sent to Lovecraft in 1936. So Leiber would have been about 26 years old at the time. That's an interesting poetic cycle, and I don't think he was influenced by Lovecraft or anybody else. But then, of course, there's a whole array of science fiction poetry, but that's a completely different genre.
Would you consider Lewis Carroll to be a weird poet?
Yeah, well, more a fantasy poet, I suppose, if you want to talk about Jabberwocky and things like that. But,
I love that.
Yeah, with
Weird in the sense of weird that it's
just
weird.
weird content.
bizarre,
Small
odd,
W weird, yeah.
you know,
Weird content
yeah,
versus mood.
right. Oh, we were talking, somebody at some point or other, we were talking about another very obscure poet you'll never have heard of, I'm sure. An American guy named Madison, I think it's K-Wine or K, I don't know how you pronounce it, C-A-W-E-I-N. He was actually very well known in his time around the late 18th, or late 19th, early 20th century. He was the poet laureate of Kentucky. Wow. No offense to Kentuckians, but I don't think they're not terribly known for poetry, but he wrote a lot of poetry, and as Kyle suggested, he actually was able to make a living at it.
He was actually very well off. He would write for the newspapers and stuff, and he made his a pretty good living off just writing poetry, and a lot of it was super weird. You get like ghosts and weird forests and like tons of poems about Halloween and monsters and the moonlit lake and all these crazy things. And
so somebody, one of these days, somebody's gonna, we're working on trying to select, to go through all his volumes of poetry, and there were a lot of them to select the best.
Trying to get a set. It's
poetry.
Really hard. He has a 5-volume collected poetry. It's super hard to get.
But there's more than that, even, I think.
Yeah.
So his poetry is all kind of out there, but one of these days you'll see a selected weird poems or the best weird poems of Madison K. Wine, and go pick it up.
So I think we have to end it now.
Yeah, I think. Anybody? Any last comments or questions?
Thanks for coming out.
Sure, it was great fun.